Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now I was planning something different for this week's video, but then I noticed a new release from our old friends the Apollo Detectives that is just so brilliant I couldn't not cover it. It's actually a pair of videos that they've released, both titled Apollo 17 and the Leaping Lunar Module. Both of them are about 30 minutes each, which combine to make an hour of them looking at photos from Apollo 17 and trying to argue there are many anomalies with the landscape and that the lunar module's position keeps changing, which apparently proves they were faking it in a studio. Now, I'm hoping that addressing this serves as a good example to conspiracy theorists that just because something doesn't immediately make sense to you doesn't automatically mean it's a lie, and that instead you should delve more into a topic before you jump to conclusions. Something which they actually demonstrate perfectly right at the start of their video before they even get into examining the surface photos from Apollo 17, because Scott brings up a PDF document that he's found relating to Apollo 17.
I decided we need to take another look at Apollo 17, where the position of the LEM actually is. I figure there's anywhere between 4 and 5 positions. So I took as many photographs as I found with the LEM. Then the PDF file is from 2002, and it is absolutely verbal diarrhea using 10-cylinder words, combining them all together, and it goes on for paragraphs.
He's found a PDF from the Journal of Geophysical Research titled Apollo 17 Landing Site, Topography, Photometric Corrections, and Heterogeneity of the Surrounding Highland Massives. A catchy title, I know. But they talk about this PDF for a while, then they get into examining the surface photos later on, and how they think the lunar module's moving around. There is actually quite a lot to unpack across this hour of videos, so I'm going to split my response into 2 videos. I'll do a separate video covering their analysis of the surface photos, in which they struggle with the concept of directions, but this video I'm going to focus on their analysis of the PDF, in which they struggle with the existence of big words.
And they do it in 10-cylinder words through that entire document. You try and read it. You can try and read any of that's in that document. It's just verbal diarrhea, just spewed. Right? When you have a look through it and just see what they've done, they've put charts up, they've done everything. They've got pixel by pixel degree angle on the lunar surface for this many degrees north, this many degrees south, and this is the resolution of the pixel by 0.000 whatever, right? All kinds of stuff that just don't make any sense.
So Scott doesn't like the amount of big words being used in the PDF. Now, fair enough. I've got a copy of that PDF, and reading over it, yes, there are a lot of complex things being discussed in there. But bear in mind, this is from a specialised journal, so its intended audience is people who are already familiar with this sort of topic and who would find it much easier to understand a lot of the language being used. It wasn't written with the mindset of it being a casual read for the average Joe public. Much like if you go and read studies from medical journals, it sounds like gibberish to people who aren't medically trained. But that doesn't stop Scott from giving a brief overview of what he thinks the paper's about.
Oh, well, the pictures have been modified pixel by pixel to create this effect and that effect. And we blurred out the mountains to smooth them. Like it says they smoothed the mountains out deliberately in that document.
Which indicates that there were features on the mountain which could be seen in different images. But if they smooth them out, they won't get seen.
What's even stranger is that PDF file that I found. It's claiming that they were using pixel by pixel because the mountains were too big to correct it so that the mountain is within the frame.
Now, I have to say, it's quite a strange argument to put across. It's also completely wrong, but I'll get onto that in a minute. They're claiming the paper is detailing how NASA, or whoever, are editing the Apollo 17 photos to fix apparent discrepancies with the distances of the landscape.
When you start digitally enhancing it like this, and then you look over on the far left side, and there's nothing there. There is no information there to glean out of anything. And yet, then we look at the center image, and then we look at the one on the right. All of a sudden, you have this beautiful hill with these craters on it, when there is absolutely nothing on the original image. There's nothing there. And then you look at the other one and compare A and B, you have a bunch of small craters there, but where are they as soon as they enhance it? They're gone.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the detectives are also very modest in claiming that it was their research being made public that prompted a panicked response from said people to try and cover up these discrepancies by editing the photos.
Well, the only thing I think, when I looked at the date on the document, that's about the first time you were in the media with David Percy talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, that time that I appeared with David Percy, the first time, that was late 90s.
Right. And they put a team together and produced this and finished it off by 2002.
I would imagine they'd looked at that because it was a fairly high-profile interview with John Ronson.
You guys actually triggered that document that I came across there. They were making excuses from then on.
Let's say for a moment that Scott's claims are all correct, that NASA faked the moon landings, but then 30 years later realized there was these inaccuracies in the photos that nobody had noticed until the conspiracy theorists started pointing them out, and then NASA therefore decided to go back and edit the photos to fix the problems. You would think that they would try and keep that under the radar and out of the public eye, rather than writing up and publicly releasing a 28-page document that details exactly how they've done all of this. But that's irrelevant anyway, because this document is actually quite the opposite of what Scott is claiming. It sounds like he's got his assessment of the document from the opening sentence, which says, quote, "A high-resolution digital elevation model for the Apollo 17 landing site and surrounding regions is used to correct photometry of Clementine ultraviolet visible multispectral data to standard viewing and illumination geometry on a pixel-by-pixel basis," end quote. Sounds like a lot of jargon, I agree, but he seems to have paired that with the various images that show the Apollo 17 landing region to various degrees of detail, and then concluded that this changing in quality and that it says it's pixel by pixel must therefore mean they're editing the Apollo 17 photos. However, even just from the shots they showed skimming over the paper, there was a clear red flag to me that they've got the topic of this completely wrong, because it repeatedly mentions FeO and TiO2. Many of the charts are labelled with this as well. Now, anybody who remembers high school chemistry may recognise FeO is iron oxide and TiO2 is titanium dioxide. Now, why would a paper all about photo editing keep mentioning iron oxide and titanium dioxide? Answer, it wouldn't. The introduction segment actually sheds some light on things by referencing the 1994 Clementine mission, which was a probe launched on January 25th, 1994, that spent 2 months in a polar orbit around the moon, using a variety of sensors such as LiDAR to map the terrain of the moon, and sensors like ultraviolet and infrared to gather a lot of data about the makeup and geology of the lunar terrain. Because one of the key purposes of collecting multiple wavelengths of light was to detect the presence of specific minerals within the lunar surface, such as iron oxide and titanium dioxide. Now, it appears all of this scan data was collected with the spacecraft looking straight down at the surface from directly above, and so the topography would then affect the accuracy of the measurements, so they needed to apply corrections to the mineral readings to account for the effect of hills and slopes. For example, on page 5 they show these images. The footnote that explains that the first column is no topographic correction, the second column is with topographic correction, and the third column is the difference between columns 1 and 2. So if we look at the row for titanium dioxide, the first image with no corrections shows a dark black circle in the bottom left corner, surrounded by a lighter surface. Now, I am not a geologist, so I don't know whether dark or light represents the presence of TiO2, but if you look at the uncorrected dark area, it's fairly even, whereas the corrected area, the upper section is much darker. And when you look at the difference column, we can see that that's because that darker region is actually a steep slope. So what appears to be quite a small surface area viewed from directly above is actually a much larger area just on quite an extreme angle to the camera. So where does Apollo 17 come into all of this, you might be thinking? Well, they actually used Apollo sample sites as a calibration for their equipment. As highlighted here, quote, "The strength of the CSR empirical calibration is that individual and lunar sample stations can be resolved in the Clementine data, yielding an empirical calibration that is based on some 48 separate data points," end quote. CSR standing for Clementine spectral reflectance. So the strength of the spectral reflectance, which I think is what is demonstrated with these images, is showing how various wavelengths of light are reflecting from the surface, and that's used to determine the makeup and the concentrations of certain minerals. And they are calibrating and checking the accuracy of these sensors using 48 sample stations from Apollo and lunar missions. And they also detailed earlier on as well in the opening paragraph where they say, quote, "Because most of the Apollo 17 sample stations were on surfaces with low slope values, the topography has only a small effect on the use of the Apollo 17 site for calibration of FeO and TiO2 parameters," end quote. It seems this probe also scanned Apollo 16 as well as part of the calibration. Areas like this were useful because these missions each did 3 EVAs and used the lunar rover, so they covered a much wider area. And they not only went to multiple designated stations, but they also made many stops with the rover in between as well. And at all of these stops, they documented and collected various rock samples, which were later tested back on Earth to learn about the geology of the moon. Tests such as seeing the concentrations of various minerals like iron oxide and titanium dioxide. So they were able to scan the Apollo 17 region with a high enough resolution that they could take a single pixel reading from over the locations of the various rock samples, and by comparing the readings that they were getting to the known values from the Apollo missions, they could see how accurate the Clementine's readings were and how good their corrections were. Knowing the accuracy of the Clementine data using a known region as a baseline calibration could then give them more confidence in the data they were getting from other unexplored regions of the moon like near the poles. So ironically for the detectives, this paper is not showing how they've faked the moon landings. It's doing actually the complete opposite, because using the data collected from Apollo 17 landing sites as a system calibration for a probe is only any use if the data from Apollo 17 is accurate in the first place. I.e., if the drilled rock samples from Apollo 17 weren't actually from the moon, and specifically from those exact spots on the moon, if they were instead from a film studio here on Earth, then all of the data about the concentrations of iron oxide and titanium dioxide in those rock samples would be completely different to what the moon actually is. So using then that inaccurate data as a calibration would then severely risk making the Clementine's data totally inaccurate and utterly worthless. And whilst the detectives are trying to suggest that this paper was done in response to people questioning the moon landings,
when I looked at the date on the document, that's about the first time you were in the media with David Percy talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, that time that I appeared with David Percy, the first time, that was late 90s.
Right. And they put a team together and produced this and finished it off by 2002.
Given that the paper was published in 2002, and only a few years prior in the late 90s, there were books and interviews coming out questioning the landings. But whilst this paper was published in 2002, it's using data that was collected in 1994, before any of those books or interviews were done. And that 1994 data, even the uncorrected data, shows a clear correlation between the mineral readings that Clementine recorded for that area of the moon versus what was noted from the various Apollo 17 sample sites. But the detectives seemingly didn't understand what the paper was about. Now, fair enough. At a quick glance, I didn't grasp it either. It's only when I then delved further into it by looking into what Clementine ultraviolet visible multispectral data actually was, coming across the Clementine mission, digging deeper into that a truer picture then started to form. Scott, however, seemingly glanced over a paper with a lot of words that he didn't understand, but based on the fact that the title included the words Apollo 17 landing site and photometric corrections, then concluded that the paper was therefore about correcting the Apollo 17 photos, even though there isn't actually a single photo from Apollo 17 anywhere in that paper. There is, however, a photo from Apollo 15, which brings me to one last thing I'd like to address about their video. Because within the later analysis of the Apollo 17 surface photos and the claims that it's all a giant studio, they start questioning how were NASA able to know the sizes of all of the small craters within the landing area before they'd even arrived.
When you look at this diagram, how did they have this diagram made 3 months before they left? And it is so accurate that when we see the photos, it lines up perfectly with this. You cannot do that from the lunar orbiter because you cannot get that kind of detail from that orbiter to show you these tiny little details that are 10 foot above the ground.
NASA chose landing sites for each mission based on various parameters depending on what they wanted to achieve with the mission. For example, Apollo 11 being the first landing and they not being sure how accurate they could be, they wanted as fewer surprises as possible, so they wanted a large region that appeared fairly sparse and smooth. Having proven the ability to land on the moon, they then wanted Apollo 12 to test how accurately they could land, so aimed for a specific landmark. In this case, it was the site of Surveyor 3, and they were able to land only 160 meters from it. After the success of this, they were then able to look at more mountainous regions for later missions where the lunar geology would be more interesting. Hence the likes of Apollo 16 and 17 being surrounded by mountains. But none of the Apollo missions went in completely blind to the landings. They would have missions fly over and photograph areas that were of consideration for future missions. For example, Apollo 10 photographed the landing area of Apollo 11, and NASA were able to verify the Apollo 17 landing site and come up with an accurate map because Apollo 15 had flown over that location almost a year and a half before. And Apollo 15 wasn't just relying on a Hasselblad camera shooting out of the window, it was actually the first Apollo mission to use a mapping camera which was mounted inside the service module of the CSM. So during which time, the mapping camera was angled down towards the moon and was taking many sweeping photos of the surface. For example, such as here in pans 9557 and 9559. Each pan consists of 8 tiles, and here is a full-size 1 gigapixel scan of tile 4 that's part of pan 9557. This is actually Apollo 17's landing area, and you can see there's a lot of detail here, and because these were taken at regular intervals and there's overlaps between each one, meaning they're taken from slightly different vantage points, and they knew the altitude and the orbital speed, they knew what the change in perspective was, so could use those images to then build a 3D profile of the area, including the sizes and the heights of mountains and craters. It's a very similar technique to what was used by US spy satellites around the same time, which, funnily enough, is what the topic of the video I was originally planning was. In fact, the mapping camera photos from Apollo 15 are what is actually used to create Photo D in the examples shown in that PDF document, which the Apollo detectives also show in their video.
You have a bunch of small craters there, but where are they as soon as they enhance it? They're gone.
Yeah.
However, the detectives forgot to include the footnote that explains to their audience what they're showing. The reason D looks sharper than C isn't because it's an enhanced version, it's because C is a scan from the Clementine's near-infrared camera, whereas D is from Apollo 15's high-resolution mapping camera. Though, that is not the most detailed view of the Apollo 17 landing site, because that actually comes from Apollo 17 itself. It too had a mapping camera on the CSM, and it was passing over its own landing site, though due to its orbital path, it was closer to the surface when above its landing site than Apollo 15 was, and here is its scan of that area. Unsurprisingly, I can take the photos of that region from both Apollo 15 and 17 and align them with each other and everything matches. I can also not only pin the exact spot where the lunar module had landed, but it's actually there in the photo, because this was taken after Apollo 17's lunar module had touched down, but before they'd begun their EVAs. So the lunar module's there, but none of the tracks are. In more recent years, though, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has photographed the Apollo 17 landing site, and I can overlay its photo showing all of the tracks onto that mapping camera scan, and again, all the craters match up. What I did find quite interesting, though, is the detectives are talking about how would the astronauts recognize the craters during the descent to know where they were going.
When he was talking to Bart, he goes, "Oh, we're orbiting around, and there it was, right in front of us. So then we descended down to land." How the hell do you know that's North Ray Crater? How many craters that size are there on the moon? Hundreds of thousands of them. You don't even know if you're in the right path. They don't have any equipment out there to tell them exactly where they are.
Now, they did know where they were going because between their own onboard guidance as well as the tracking stations on Earth, they knew their orbital path, they knew where their location was above the lunar surface as well as their speed and altitude. Just like how on missions that they did in low Earth orbit, they not only knew where they were above the Earth, but they were able to plot a perfect re-entry to land them in the ocean within a matter of miles of recovery ships. And it's not like they're just looking for a particular crater amongst hundreds of craters in lunar orbit. Charlie actually specified in that discussion they were only a few thousand feet above the surface when they pitched over.
Very dynamic situation. We pitched over at 7,000 feet, and that's the first time you saw the lunar surface where you were going to land. And
7,000 feet.
Yeah, and I looked out and looked to the right to see if I could see the North Ray Crater up there, and we were right on target.
The guidance computer ran an automated descent most of the way down that got them into the right general area. The astronauts then took over for the final approach. You can even see from the onboard video of Apollo 16's powered descent just how close they were to landing at the point that they saw those craters.
64 at 8,200. Pro. Pitch over. Pitch over. And here it is, Gators, Lone Star. Right on. Call me the thanks, Charlie. Okay.
And there were only 3 craters there, and North Ray was the biggest one, so it was not really difficult for Charlie to work out which was which. But while Scott is arguing this point, the footage that's being played in the background of their video is from the 16mm camera on board Apollo 17's lunar module. This was after they'd separated from the command module to begin their descent. You can actually see the CSM in front of them, and this is literally as they are flying over their landing area. They even take the camera off the mount to point it down to see where they're going to be landing. So they knew exactly where they were. They just let themselves run another orbit around the moon whilst they got their systems ready, and then they began the powered descent down into the Taurus-lit Roe Valley. So much like the PDF document, something doesn't fit in their mind about a topic, but rather than think, I'm not sure I understand this, so I'm going to dig deeper, they seem to go, I'm not sure I understand this, but I'm completely sure the moon landings were fake, so therefore this must somehow point to it being faked as well. The crew of Apollo 17 absolutely knew the layout of the region that they were looking to land in, hence they moved the camera to specifically point at it and film. Though it seems the Apollo detectives don't know the layout of the region that Apollo 17 landed in, judging by their attempts to analyse the landscape in the surface photos from the mission. But that will be for the next video, and I don't think you want to miss it. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to see the next one, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments while you're down there, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.